Uh, it's been a real honour to know four generations now of your family. Really very, very special as a rabbi. But this evening is about hearing your voices, not mine. Just a little bit of me at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you, Bob, and to Anne.
Thank you very much, Aaron. In a moment, we'll get the slideshow going. Okay, right. Are we all right with the presentation, Richard? Well, I tried without the PowerPoint for the moment. Well, I was born in Hanover in northern Germany in 1925. My dad, Joseph Kirchheimer, owned a textile business. Mother, Hedwig, ran the home and was involved in a lot of charity work. Now, I had two siblings, a sister, 11 years older, brother born in 1923, and then there was me, the baby of the family. Now, Germany after the First World War was not a happy place. The Versailles Treaty had shown Germany of 13% of its population and territory, all its colonies, and a significant part of its manufacturing capacity. Thank you. There's Mum and Dad. That brought severe economic problems. There's a lot of unemployment and serious inflation. And just as things started to look up a little, there came the Wall Street crash of 1929, and everything went pear-shaped. A lot of economic and political upheaval. The many parties in the Weimar Republic Reichstag couldn't or wouldn't cooperate. The military and the industrialists thought they could control Hitler. And so after two elections in rapid succession, the Nazis became the largest party, and Hitler was appointed chancellor. Took office on the 30th of January, 1933. The Nazi program, which had been clearly outlined in Mein Kampf, went into immediate overdrive. In short order, a number of laws were enacted. Some liberties were curtailed. The cabinet, for which Reed Hitler was empowered to govern by decree, and the Reichstag became totally ineffective. Opposition to the enabling, there was an enabling act to bring in that government by decree. And opposition to that was effectively silenced by the simple expedient of arresting the 81 communist deputies who could have been expected to vote against, and intimidating others. Power was taken to retire or dismiss civil servants. Technically, the law for the reconstruction of the civil service, what it meant that non-Aryans, for which reached Jews, as well as communists and those of related organizations, could be retired or dismissed. That included professors, teachers, judges, later lawyers, doctors, tax consultants, and very curiously, musicians. All professions in which there were a lot of Jews. By July 1933, so in a very few short months, the federal state of Germany had been replaced by a central one-party dictatorship, with total control over the judiciary, the police, including the secret police, the Gestapo, the civil service, whose tentacles reached into every aspect of public life, If you're a member of a sports club in a little village, you could guarantee that somebody in there was an informer. Immediately, life, particularly for Jews, started to change forever. The Nazi ideology was based on persecution, humiliation, and discrimination against the other, anyone who didn't fit the idea of a pure Aryan master race. Germany was to become Judenrein, clean of Jews, not Judenfrei, free of Jews, but clean of Jews. There's a difference. Within weeks, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses. Let's see if this works. Richard, help. Yeah, there's a boycott. In other words, pickets outside Jewish shops, warning people not to go in there, don't buy from these people. With uniform pickets outside, making life very difficult. That was followed on the 10th of May by the public burning of books. That's an impression of what happened on the Weberplatz in Berlin. These paintings were made by Hans Jackson, who was a boy of about my own age in Berlin at that time, and did these from memory later. In Berlin alone, about 50,000 books by Jewish and other authors who were considered to be anti-Nazi were burned. That was replicated in just about every university city throughout Germany. And very sadly, in most cases, the students participated very enthusiastically. Then we got the erection of Stürmerkästen, these red boxes carrying copies of Der Stürmer, the stormtrooper, a virulently anti-Jewish newspaper dedicated just to that, to publishing vicious stories about what Jews were doing to the German economy, to German society, to describe them as a danger to the nation, subhumans, vermin, coupled with suitable cartoons. The fact that at the same time, Jews were being accused of controlling the world economy had nothing to do with it. And all that was reinforced by the Nuremberg laws of 1935, under which we lost all our civic rights. We were barred from voting, no longer considered citizens, we were just subjects. Mixed marriages and relationships were forbidden. There were a great many divorces at that time. Many families were torn apart, and in many cases, the non-Jewish partner took the children. Later, every Jewish male had to take the name Israel. That's my passport, Rudolf Israel Kirchheimer. Every female, the name Sarah. Because everybody had to carry identity documents, it was easy to pick us up as Jews. Month by month, year by year, the screws were being turned from petty rules like park benches designated for Jews only, to Judenverboten, Jews forbidden, signs outside restaurants, theaters, cinemas, and the like, and swimming pools. Special taxation, right up to the forced sale of Jewish businesses to non-Jews at ridiculous prices. The objective was to drive Jews out of the social, political, and economic life of the country. And living standards were declining all the time. Even we children noticed that, but of course the parents tried to shield us as much as possible. At school, life was no easier. Even at primary school, most of my friends joined the Hitler Youth that became compulsory in 1936. They were under orders not to talk to or play with the Jewish children. quite hard to understand for a 7-year-old in early 33. From having really enjoyed school, the playground became quite a lonely place. Later at secondary school, I was often just allowed to sit at the back of the class, keep my mouth shut, and don't even think of participating. One doesn't learn an awful lot that way. A great handicap in later life. And of course, there was much bullying. With all that, why didn't we just leave? Easier said than done. My dad resisted that idea. He'd fought in the First World War. He'd been wounded a number of times and held decorations, including the Iron Cross. Like many others of his generation, thought Hitler couldn't possibly last. But immigration was also difficult. From the beginning, there was a flight tax based on a fiscal measure from 1931 on assets and income. In 1934, that was 25%. It rose eventually to 90%. But that meant even if you got out, you had no assets left with which to establish yourself. And that was a real obstacle when trying to get in somewhere else. No assets, no entry. And every country except Shanghai had entry quotas. And the Evian conference in July 38 showed very clearly that there was no international will to address the refugee problem. Now, in October 38, the Nazis expelled some 18,000 Poles, by definition mostly Jewish. There'd been no consultation, so predictably the Poles made difficulties, leaving about half these poor people camped in makeshift accommodation on the border. One family got word to their 17-year-old son studying in Paris, asking for help. He couldn't help, of course, but he could get in a great rage. Went out, bought a gun, went to the German embassy and shot the third secretary, Ernst vom Rath, who died of his wounds 2 days later on the 9th of November. That night, more than 1,000 synagogues all over Germany, Austria and Sudetenland were attacked, burned, or otherwise vandalized, together with homes, shops, offices, schools, and communal institutions. 91 people were murdered that night, several thousand more in the weeks and months that followed. And 30,000 men from the age of 16 upwards were marched off to concentration camps. My father managed to evade arrest by hiding in his warehouse on the 4th floor of a commercial building all night. Now, quite unaware of that, I went to school, as usual that morning, to be met at the gate by one of the few teachers who was usually sympathetic. What was I doing there? I've come to school, sir. Well, don't you know what happened? So I obviously looked suitably dumb. And he explained the events of the night, told me to go home and not even to think of coming back to school. That was the end of my schooling, as for all Jewish children in Germany. Those attacks included the synagogue in Hanover, a beautiful building dating from 1870. The interior is very reminiscent of West London Synagogue, same vintage. And this is what it looked like at midnight on the 9th to the 10th of November. The following day, there were a lot of sightseers around the ruin. That night became known as Kristallnacht, a term coined by the Nazis. Doesn't sound so bad. Crystal, glitters, quite pretty. We call it pogrom night. The story was that this was the spontaneous popular reaction to von Rath's murder. Millions of pounds worth of damage was done that night. And the Jewish community The victims were hit with a fine of 1 billion Reichsmark. Not sure what the real conversion is. It was probably in the region of 250 to 300 million pounds. After all the special taxes and the inability of Jews to earn a living anyway, there wasn't that sort of money around. I don't know whether it ever all got paid. But the systematic impoverishment of the community continued. A few weeks later, people's valuables were confiscated. I remember going to the local police station with my father, carrying a few bags with our valuables, mostly mum's jewelry, of course. All my parents had left after that were their wedding rings. Now, one effect of Kristallnacht was to accelerate emigration, which had been the objective of all the oppression from the start, of course, with many families breaking up and scattering to different parts of the world. My sister had left in 1936. We didn't meet again for 45 years. Another effect was the response of the British government, who, after a debate in the Commons, agreed to allow 10,000 unaccompanied children to enter Britain on group rather than individual visas, provided they didn't become a charge on the state. Over to Anne.
Well, I was born Hannah Kuhn, Kuhn, in Berlin to Franz and Hertha Kuhn. My earliest memories start when I was about 3 years old, living in Cologne. My parents were a professional couple, my mum going out to work, while Agnes, our maid, looked after me. Dad was also an excellent amateur musician, playing the cello and the piano. We had a very large flat in Cologne with a music library room, and I remember listening to Dad playing quartets with his Jewish and non-Jewish friends. We also had a boat, and I have wonderful memories of sailing up and down the Rhine. And then one day, a lot of grey uniformed soldiers marched up the street, and my parents did not look happy. Soon after that, Agnes had to leave us, and she hadn't done anything wrong, and I couldn't understand why. And Mum explained that this was due to recent Nazi legislation. So soon after that, Agnes had to leave us, and we moved to Cottbus, a small town southeast of Berlin, as my parents' jobs had also become untenable due to these new laws. I was very aware of the change in our living conditions. We still had our music library room, but my parents slept on a sofa bed in the dining room. And of course, the boat had to go. Now, by early 1938, my parents had made many attempts to emigrate, but all their applications had been turned down. So Dad decided to go to Berlin to retrain as a chronologist and masseur, in the hope that with that qualification, we would find it easier to emigrate. While he was training, Mum obtained a job in Western Germany, taking me with her, living in 2-room digs. Now, Dad qualified in September 1938, and Mum and I rejoined him in Berlin. We lived in temporary accommodation with some cousins, as my parents were finding it very difficult to find a flat where he could also practice. Because, of course, normally the reply was, "We don't want Jews living next to us." Now, during the night of the 9th of November, I woke up to see Mum, Dad, and the cousins rushing about very agitatedly. In the morning, my parents told me we would not be sleeping there that night. We went out into the street, and what did I see? Glass just everywhere, shattered windows, used jeering, doping, graffiti on the walls, police just looking in, and Jewish men sweeping up the glass and boarding up smashed windows. That was Kristallnacht. Well, we spent the day on the move the whole time, walking on buses, on the underground. When we wanted to eat, I was sent into a sandwich bar because with my red hair, I didn't look Jewish. When I asked why we could not stop anywhere, Dad told me that during the night, many Jewish men had been taken, and he hoped that by staying on the move, he would not be arrested. Now, during our walks from district to district, I saw very many synagogues smoldering, with sacred Torah scrolls just strewn into the street, being vandalized. And that memory still haunts me to this day. Well, that night, we stayed in a flat, above of all things, a police station. It belonged to a friend of Mum's who just emigrated to London and who had given the key to Mummy to sell the flat. Dad thought the Gestapo would never think of looking for him above a police station. Well, we stayed there for about 10 days until things began to calm down. And we then managed to find a flat. I went back to school, and Mum retrained as a manicurist beautician to complement Dad in his practice.
Now, Kristallnacht happened on the 9th to the 10th of November. The debate in Parliament was held on the 21st. And as soon as the way had been cleared, the Central British Fund, now World Jewish Relief, went into action, very strongly supported by the Society of Friends, the Salvation Army, and one or two other organizations. They were pretty well prepared. Since 1933, about 70,000 refugees had arrived in Britain. Proportionately, Britain did a lot better than many other countries. The Children's Committee worked so efficiently that the first train carrying children from a Berlin orphanage left on the 2nd of December, less than 4 weeks after Kristallnacht. And the trains and the ships kept coming until a few days before war broke out on the 3rd of September, 1939. And that operation, of course, became known as the Kindertransport. And it always saved 9,354 children. That doesn't account for the 669 children brought over by Nicholas Winton. It must have been so hard for our parents to let us go. Waiting for them must have been hell. The idea was sold to us children as the great adventure. We were going to be the pioneers, the vanguard. And of course, the parents would follow as soon as they had their papers.
Well, 2 months after Kristallnacht, my parents told me that I would be going to England on a Kindertransport. I would be looked after by 2 Jewish unmarried sisters. Mum's best friend, the very one whose flat we had borrowed on Kristallnacht, had met these 2 ladies and had told them that her good friend in Berlin was desperately trying to get her daughter, me, out of Germany. Now, the rabbi at the the sister synagogue, the liberal Jewish synagogue in St. John's Wood, had in fact just been preaching that the congregation really should think seriously about taking in a child from the kinder transport. So the Mrs. Levy agreed to offer me a home, and my parents enrolled me on the kinder transport lists. I had to write to these ladies, whom I was to call aunties. Photographs were exchanged, and we also talked on the phone in the very little English I was learning at school. Remember, I was just 10 years old. Mom took me to the local town hall, where police took my fingerprints for my identity card. I was terrified, but on the whole, they were quite friendly. Now, finally, on the 19th of April, I left home and we arrived at the station. There were crowds of weeping parents and children, but we three, we kept up a pretense. Oh, what an adventure you're going on, and we will soon be joining you. As the whistle went for the final goodbye, Mom and Dad kissed and hugged me. And whispered that I should look out of the train window the next station but one. I did this, and there were my parents on the platform, waving as if their arms would drop off. But that was the last time I ever saw my parents. The train went to Hamburg, where we boarded an American liner, the Manhattan. The crew made a terrific fuss of us all, but in spite of guitar-led singing, no one was in the mood, and there were a lot of tears. We arrived at Southampton 2 days later, where we boarded a train to Waterloo. I want you to look at the picture at the bottom, because it says there, leave to grant at Southampton granted, provided that the holder does not enter any employment, paid or unpaid. Well, I was 10 years old. Was I likely to take up any employment, paid or unpaid? Well, as I say, we arrived at Waterloo, and there we sat in a large hall, each with our labels around our necks, waiting to be collected. When Hannah Kuhn was called, I went to the barrier, and there were the aunties whom I recognized from their photographs.
Well, I joined my train in Hanover on the 3rd of May, just a fortnight after Anne, feeling scared, excited, apprehensive, hot and cold, not knowing where I was going. The train crossed northern Germany to the Dutch border, where the border police came on board and checked papers, and most particularly luggage. Many valuable possessions were confiscated, including my stamp collection, for which I must admit I didn't have an export permit. But the reception in Holland, once we crossed over, was fantastic, with drinks, sandwiches, and huge warm smiles, something we hadn't experienced from strangers for years. The sudden feeling of release and relief is unimaginable. The train went on to the Hook of Holland, where we boarded a ferry for Harwich. First disappointment. Coming to England for most of us, of course, meant going to Dover. We were going to Harwich, so no white cliffs, and the Essex coastline isn't nearly as interesting. Anyway, we got to Harwich, got on another train, which took us to Liverpool Street, where we sat on our cases in a big hall to be collected by our sponsors, rather than like that little girl on the right there. She's very reminiscent. These transports are commemorated by this Meisler statue in Hope Square. He made other sculptures in Berlin, where it's a two-ended one. We've just seen the other one. The bright bronze one facing west, the black one facing east. They went on quite a different train journey. There's also a sculpture in Gdansk, where Frank Meisler came from, and one in Hoek of Holland. So he traced his journey from his hometown of Gdansk to Liverpool Street.
Now, the aunts had been advised to send me to boarding school to learn English. So my first fortnight was spent in being kitted out in school uniform, an unknown custom in Germany, so yet another additional shock. I hated that boarding school. The girls bullied me as I was a stranger, and I was very lonely and miserable. However, the outbreak of war in September 1939 meant that I didn't have to go back to that school, but instead joined South Hampstead High School, which was evacuated to Berkhamsted. There were many Jewish girls in that school. Including refugees, but we never talked about our German lives. I soon settled very happily into the English way of life. Now, before the war, my parents and I obviously exchanged letters several times a week. But once war started, we were allowed just one Red Cross message of 25 words once a month each way. However, sometimes these messages were censored. And you know, even with modern technology, we still do not know what my dad was trying to say under those black lines. However, then in December 42, Dad sent a frantic message to the aunts to say my mum had been transported by the 25th transport. And in February 43, we received a last message from Dad. After that, there was just silence. Many years later, I discovered they had both been sent to Auschwitz. Now, when I was 18, I wanted to go to university, but the aunts maintained that if by some miracle my parents had survived the camps, I would have to be in a position to support them until they could find their feet. And so they refused to pay for university, but instead sent me to a very good secretarial college.
Earlier, I mentioned sponsors. These were the people who had made themselves responsible for individual children and backed that with £50 per child. Quite a lot of money in 1939. Now my sponsor, all I ever knew about him that his name was Smith, had very generously given guarantees for 6 boys. So he put down £300 and said, I'll have half a dozen, please, which was very generous. But he wanted each of us to stay with him. So after a week, I had to move on. That was bad news. I was probably told at the beginning, but not speaking any English, hadn't understood. I was lucky. I was sent to a young family with 2 children. They sent me to school. I started to learn a bit of English. And I was very happy. But 8 weeks later, I had to move on again, this time to a hostel in Westgate, and stayed there about eight or 9 weeks. And then in the middle of August, came back to London to yet another hostel, just in time to join a school to be evacuated at the beginning of the war. We became the village school in Whipsnade, outside the zoo, I would have you know, where I spent 2 years, followed by just under 3 years in a factory doing designated war work. And then I joined the army. As a volunteer, you asked what you'd like to do. So I said, Royal Signals, please, because I'd been sector signaller in the Home Guard. You can't do that, you're an enemy alien. I got naturalized in 1947, but I was accepted in the Royal Artillery. But after training, which took a few months, I was transferred to a prisoner of war camps as an interpreter. That was a very, very interesting job. And I have to admit that it gave me some pleasure to explain to German soldiers that I was a German-born Jew. Now, in demobilization in 1948, jobs were hard to come by. I did find a job, but that was a dead end. And when Anne and I met later that year, it was time to find something with more prospect. Having lost out on a decent education, I spent the 10 years following our marriage in 1950 doing correspondence courses while working full-time. Finally qualified as a charter company secretary, and 44 years later retired, still being a company secretary, but also finance director. During the time, both Anne and I got very deeply involved in the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, and I got very much involved in Leo Baeck College. Anne mentioned the Red Cross messages. Mine stopped in the autumn of 1941. Immediately after the war, I found out that my parents had been transported to Riga in December 41. There they died. Just how, I don't know, but I can guess. In 1946, I received a letter from a survivor, which was only too graphic. Today, there's a public memorial in the center of town to the 2,500 murdered citizens of Hanover. On top of that, of course, there are increasingly more Stolpersteine, little brass plaques let into the pavement in front of the last voluntary address of the victims.
Well, after college, I obtained a post as secretary in an educational publishing firm, but I soon enrolled in a 2-year evening book and magazine production course at the London School of Printing and qualified with a first-class pass, after which I was promoted to editorial assistant. Eventually, I became senior editor at the Heinemann Medical Books, and in retirement, I was the technical editor of Little Judaism's 2 new prayer books, as you all know, and I still am very active at the LJS in St. John's Wood Road. Now, my kinder transport experience was in fact rather unique in that I knew to whom I was going, and what is even more important, my parents knew where I was going. Most kinder and their parents had no idea what would happen to the children. Very many of them went from hostel to hostel without having the opportunity to live in a family. Some sponsors treated their children, especially the girls, as extra domestic help and were not very kind. And some children, especially the very young ones, were not even told about their Jewish roots. But on the whole, most Kindertransport children eventually settled down happily, married, and started new families. Bob and I have 2 sons, 3 wonderful grandchildren, and now 2 very, very adorable great-grandchildren.
So those are our stories. We were the lucky ones. Our parents had the courage to send us out of harm's way. It was a severe shock to us, of course, and an enormous upheaval in our young lives. But it was all done in a very orderly fashion, with proper paperwork, transcripts provided, and kind strangers to look after us all the way. And we did have support in making new lives for ourselves. So that's our story.
Bob and Anne, thank you so immensely much for sharing with us your story of your birth and childhoods in Germany, your experience on the Kindertransport, and then settling in this country. I feel immensely privileged to hear you, and I've heard you before speak. Each time I learn something new, as I'm sure that we all do. I'm immensely proud to have known you and the generations of your family, and likewise to welcome into this special space Nellie and Walter and others. You are immensely special people to us, and we have been so proud and honoured to know you. I'm now going to share my screen where we have some short prayers before we will then unmute everybody to allow you to be able to speak and give your words of thanks to Bob and to Anne. So even though you may not be able to hear each other, please do join in, and I'll ask my helpers here to join me in the responsive reading. We remember our 6 million who died when madness ruled and evil dwelt on earth. We remember those of whom we know and those whose very names are lost. We cherish the memory of those who died as martyrs, those who died resisting, and those who died in terror. We mourn for all that died with them, their goodness and their wisdom, which could have done so much to ennoble and enrich humanity. We mourn for the genius and the wit that died, the learning and the laughter that were lost. We stand in gratitude for the simple, decent lives of those who were the congregation of Israel. Their spiritual resistance remains as an enduring testimony to a community where light persisted in darkness. Each person was unique, and we remember them all in love and compassion. We salute those who had the courage to stand outside the mob, to save us and to suffer with us. They too are God's witnesses and a source of hope when we are tempted to despair. Because of our people's suffering, may such times never come again, and may their sacrifice not be in vain. In our daily fight against cruelty and prejudice, tyranny and persecution, their memory gives us strength. In silence, we remember them, those who sanctified God's name. El Male Rachamim, Shochem Bamromim, Tsei menucha nochana tachad kanfei hashkina. In kudoshimut chorim kuzoha harakia mashirim. Et nishmot rivavot al fei Yisrael. Shemeitu al kirush Hashem. Ba'al harachamim. Astireim b'seite knafecha lo olamim. Bitro bitro chachaim et nishmotam. Adonai hu nachalatam. Yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavam. Noma. Amen. God full of compassion, exalted God, grant perfect rest under the wings of your presence among the holy and pure who shine as the brightness of the firmament. To the souls of the millions of our people who died for the sanctification of your name. Merciful God, shelter them forever under your wings, and let their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they find their destiny in your nearness, and may they rest in peace. Amen. And although it is not necessary or always traditional to recite Kaddish at these moments, I feel it is only appropriate and in our tradition to do so. May we all have in our hearts and minds the names, the lives, the good people who died during the Holocaust, were murdered in the Shoah. And so for all of them, we recite together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalma divrach Yerutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, v'agalah v'zman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach leolam u'lalmei almaya. Yiparach v'ishtabach v'yitpa'ah v'tromam v'yitnaseh, v'tada v'talei v'talal shemei d'kudesha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran v'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei shlama Rabba min Shemaya, Chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'imromav, u'ya'asei shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol b'nei adam, v'imru Amen. And once more, just to thank Bob and Anne for their contribution this evening in speaking to us and to sharing your memories, which are always painful. We thank you for doing so on this eve of Yom Hashoah. It is a slightly bizarre Yom Hashoah this year, but still we have done what we should do, which is to honor the 6 million and many more who were murdered through the Shoah, to come together in quite incredible numbers here this evening. And I hope that next year we will all be able to meet in person and that we actually come together in such numbers, because I don't think we've achieved such numbers, but maybe that says something about the incredible nature of what we're able to achieve at this moment in time. We're going to stop live streaming now and unmute everybody, so that if you want to, in turn, please do speak to Bob and Anne and give your thanks. And then if you wouldn't mind leaving, please, because then hopefully at the end we'll be left just with your family, and for you to be able to chat with your family this evening without us. We'll hide ourselves. That's one of the things that we're so grateful for, that you're able to meet this evening as the Kirk family.
And